Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I think so, yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'll just
Published by Oxford 2019. Professor Vinaylal's scholarly work has been translated into several Indian languages and other languages for French, German, Spanish, Finnish, Korean, Persian, and his shorter essays and popular writings have been translated into some 40 languages, including Portuguese, Ukrainian, Slovak, Russian, Bosnian, Polish, Greek, etc. His works in progress include a book on the history of colonial India, told through stories, a study of internet Hinduism, and two books of Indian nationalism and visual imaginary. A two-volume collection of his essays on Gandhi will be published by Orient Black Swan in mid-2021. Professor Vinay Lal, we are truly delighted to have you with us today. St. Aloysius College and Nehru Study Centre takes pride in organizing this particular webinar. Over to you, Professor Vinay for your address. Your address will be followed by the question answer sessions. I request the participants to put up their questions in the chat box, and our team at St. Aloysius College will monitor and help in the interactive session. Thank you very much once again, and over to you, sir.
Uh, thank you very much, Professor D'Souza, for your introduction. Let me begin by acknowledging my thanks to St. Aloysius College, the Department of Political Science, as well as to, of course, the Nehru Study Centre at Mangalore University. And in particular, my thanks to Professor Rajaram Tolpade for his kind invitation to be the first speaker in this, as he has pointed out, very ambitious series of lectures on the principal figures, or some of the principal figures of the 19th and 20th century in India. So the title of my talk has been mentioned 4 times already, so I'm not going to mention it now myself. It is going to be a talk on Gandhi and nursing. But before I begin my formal talk, which has been written up as a paper, and there's a very small portion of this, which is appearing in a book, which will be published next week. It's a book I wrote over 45 days of the summer on the coronavirus. But it's not a scientific account of it because I'm not a scientist. I'm someone who works in political theory, cultural history, what I've called the politics of knowledge system. So it's basically a book on the politics and cultural histories of pandemics, and in particular this pandemic in the midst of which we are placed right now. And I have to say, I'm prepared to answer any questions about the coronavirus pandemic in general later on, if someone should have any, although this talk is really not on the pandemic, except that it is on the ethics of how to look after people, the ethics of healing, the ethics of nursing, and what insights Gandhi brings to it. But I have to say that this particular pandemic is in fact actually unprecedented. We don't have any example of something of this kind in history. Those of you who are historians might raise your eyebrows and say, well, that's impossible because there's always a precedent for everything. If historians didn't have a precedent, they'd be out of a job. But this, in fact, actually is unprecedented because we do not have on record the kind of state intervention and the level of state intervention globally that we have had in this pandemic. There was a very big pandemic in 1957, one in 1968. Both of them led to at least 1 million dead. In both of them, neither of them even made it to the history books. You'd be astonished to know that, right? And one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't have the kind of level of state intervention that we've seen in this particular pandemic. But anyhow, this is not really the subject of the talk. I only mentioned this in the context because once the pandemic started unfolding, as someone who has worked on Gandhi and who's also a cultural historian, the question naturally really came to me, and many people started asking me the question, what would Gandhi have said or done in these times? Right? How might he have reacted, for example, to some of the questions that have really come about as a consequence of the situation in which we have all been placed, where travel globally has become nearly impossible. I myself have a mother who lives in Gurgaon, and generally I visit her 4 times a year, and I haven't been able to visit her since January, and the likelihood is that I'm not going to be able to go if I want to ensure her safety and my safety and the safety of many others until probably several months from now, and perhaps not even as early as mid 2021. As the epidemiologists say, when you've seen one pandemic, you've only seen one. You haven't seen, if there's a pandemic 20 years from now, it's not certain that the experience of this pandemic will necessarily be very useful. It may be, it may not be, right? Um, but the other fundamental question, and this is all by way of a preface, because I haven't gotten into the substantive nature of my remarks here. The other fundamental question that I want to think about, and I'd invite you to think about with me, is how does one think of nonviolence in these times? And I mean, in particularly in respect to the coronavirus, because of course there is an occasion to think about nonviolence globally today. I mean, my own personal view of the matter. Some of you may not share that view, and there may be disagreement about it. But my own view of the matter is that we are slowly creeping towards totalitarianism in many parts of the world. I won't specify all the list of countries where that's happening, but it's certainly happening in the United States, where I am at the moment. And it's certainly happening in our part of the world and in many other parts of the world as well, right? The question now is, why is it that we always think of nonviolence to the extent that we think of it at all? Because frankly, I don't really think that we think about it very much. But when we do think about it, it's always in the context of conflict. So, for example, if you look at the second half of the 20th century, after the assassination of Gandhi on 30th January 1948, if you take the next 50 years, we see that when we think of Gandhi's legacy, who are we thinking of? We're thinking of Nelson Mandela and the people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, Oliver Tambo, Ahmed Kathrada, many others. We are thinking of Aung San Suu Kyi. I know, of course, that now she is discredited, but all of you should remember that 10 years ago, she was a heroic figure in the eyes of the whole world. Right? And we think, of course, preeminently of the civil rights movement in the United States, where every major civil rights leader was deeply steeped in the writings, thought, and philosophy of Gandhi. Every single major figure in the civil rights movement, without the shadow of a doubt. And then we think of, let's say, someone like the Dalai Lama. But if you take these four examples, you see that we are already thinking of nonviolence in the context of conflict. For Mohandas Gandhi, nonviolence was a way of being in the world. It was not simply a mode of resistance to colonialism. It was not simply a mode of resistance to oppressions within Indian society. It was all of that. I'm not saying it wasn't that, but what I'm simply suggesting is that nonviolence was completely a part of his way of being in the world. It was inescapably intertwined with every action and thought of his life. So, what does it mean to lead a non-violent life, right? And this in turn means that, for example, we can think not only of not committing violence, and when I say violence here, I don't mean simply physical violence, because violence takes many forms. If parents speak very, very loudly all the time to their children, or if a man abuses his wife, right? Not necessarily physically, but even in other respects, simply by being disrespectful. All of these, and multitudes of other ways, all of these are forms of violence, right? So we are enjoined when we think of nonviolence, we are enjoined to think about what we should not do, right? And we can think in English of acts of omission and acts of commission, right? What we should not do and what we should do. What would be our responsibility if we were trying to lead a life of nonviolence? Uh, in Indian thought, the categories you could use would be yam and niyam, right? The social restraints and the self disciplines, things that one should not do, things that one should abstain from, but also things that one should try to do. It is in this context that I want to explore the whole idea of Gandhi as a figure of nursing. And when we think about Gandhi, at least to someone like me who's been thinking about Gandhi since I finished high school over 40 years ago, there is no question in my mind that Gandhi is a fount that can never be exhausted. In almost every domain of life, he has something to tell us, right? And it so turns out that he actually does have a lot to tell us about the ethics of nursing. Now, of course, it is the case, to move into my formal remarks now, it is the case, of course, that he does not occupy any place in the histories of nursing in India. If you picked up let's say, an article or a book on the history of nursing in India, you would find Gandhi barely even mentioned. All right. But it should come as no surprise, of course, to you, given what I've already said, or if you have reflected on his long career as perhaps the principal exponent in world history of the idea of nonviolence, that Gandhi displayed a great affinity for nursing and thought of it as a noble way of rendering service to humankind. Ahimsa for him is nothing but love, a mode of ministering to the soul and nursing the wounds of others, as well as those which are self inflicted. Yet Gandhi also had, we should acknowledge, a withering critique, a devastating critique of modern medicine and doctors. A critique that, as you can well expect, does not sit well with the medical profession, although it is notable that this critique did not extend to nursing. He took a very different view of nursing itself. Right? And I also say this with the full awareness of the fact that his thoughts on nursing, which I've hinted at, but I'm putting it in a different way now, do not actually conform to the textbook prescriptions of nursing. So why is it that he had a critique of modern medicine? He viewed modern medicine as animated by the evil of vivisection and plagued by the profit motive, but his critique of it has other socio ethical, political, and philosophical dimensions that are far beyond the scope of the present paper. And here I would recommend to those of you who are seriously interested in looking at an epistemological critique of modern Western medicine to take a look at an extraordinary paper that was published about 35 years ago by Ashish Nandi and Shiv Vishwanathan, his colleague at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, published in a book called Dominating Knowledges. And the article is called Modern Medicine and Its Non-Modern Critics. Right? And a portion of that paper is devoted to the views of Gandhi. Not the entire paper, just a very small portion of the paper. Now, in his 1909 treatise, Hind Swaraj on Indian Home Rule, which is increasingly being viewed as the most fundamental expression of his ideas, although it does not have the kind of traction that his autobiography still has. In this work, his critique of the figure of the doctor, we find, is fundamentally rooted in his deep suspicion of what he calls the third party. All right. So I'm also offering some of you who may be familiar with Hind Swaraj, and for those of you who are not, I would advise you to really become familiar with it, because if there's one Indian text, modern Indian text, that I think we should know, that every Indian should know, I think it's unquestionably Hind Swaraj. But in this particular work, if you know the structure of it, so he has long chapters on Hindu-Muslim unity or disunity in the present times. He has chapters on the railways, on doctors, on lawyers. And one of the things that is common to all of these is his critique of what I'm calling, based on Gandhi's own idea, of the third party. Just as lawyers come between two adversaries and only profit themselves, so the lawyer is the third party, right? And just as the British drove a wedge between the Hindus and the Muslims and set themselves up as a transcendent peacekeeper, so the doctor appeared to Gandhi as someone who distances the patient from his or her own body. Right? Gandhi's claim is that modern medicine and the doctor, who is the embodiment of that system, actually prevents the patient from knowing his or her own body. And so, therefore, the doctor is now the third party, that is, the person who comes between the patient and the body. Right? He imagines the circumstances under which a visit to a doctor becomes necessary. And I quote him here, quote, "I have indulged in vice. I contract a disease. A doctor cures me, the odds are that I shall repeat the vice. The odds are that I shall repeat the vice. Had the doctor not intervened, nature would have done its work and I would have acquired mastery over myself, would have been freed from vice, and would have become happy." End quote. Now, happy is not what, of course, others have been with Gandhi's critique of modern medicine and its practitioners. And many have dismissed Hind Swaraj and certainly his critique of railways, hospitals, and the legal profession as an ill-informed diatribe. At that time itself, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, whom Gandhi greatly admired and whom he considered one of his several mentors, one of his many mentors, Gokhale was very embarrassed by this work and he said it's going to go into the dustbin of history. Right? However, Gandhi's position on modern medicine is easily mischaracterized. In accepting an invitation to inaugurate the opening of a medical college, that is Tibia College, in Delhi in 1921, Gandhi offered what he called, quote, his humble tribute to the spirit of research that fires the modern scientist, while adding this proviso: "My quarrel is not against that spirit. My complaint is against the direction that the spirit has taken. It is, it has chiefly concerned itself with the exploration of laws and methods conducing to the merely material advancement of its clientele." End quote. It is not without reluctance that he accepted the invitation. And the invitation, incidentally, to him comes because originally it was going to be the viceroy who had been offered the invitation to inaugurate the college. But then in 1921, for those of you who remember, you know that this became the height of the non-cooperation movement, which Gandhi had launched in 1920, and which he was going to suspend in 1922 after the incident of Chowri Chowra. But this was the height of it. So obviously at that time, would have been very awkward for the viceroy to come. And so in place of the viceroy, it was Gandhi who was invited, right? But he says that his reluctance to accept this invitation comes from the fact that he wants his audience to know that I hold strange views on medicine and hospitals and have scrupulously avoided any special contact with such institutions, end quote. And yet, as he told a German visitor who met with him in 1937, so this is 16 years later, he did not, quote, despise all medical treatment, did not. I know we can learn a lot from the West about safe maternity and the care of infants, end quote. If then his outlook on medicine still remains unacceptable to many, on the question of nursing, however, he adopted views that may be rather more agreeable and even admirable to most people, most particularly at this time of the coronavirus pandemic, when healthcare practitioners are being celebrated the world over as frontline workers who have put their lives at risk. He might have thought, incidentally, that the effortless ease with which we have all fallen into speaking of the front line suggests the extent to which we have unthinkingly absorbed the vocabulary of war into our thinking. Even if he would have understood the spirit in which we have been all called to recognize and applaud the altruistic behavior of those, particularly nurses, who have become part of the course of essential workers. Indeed, it is not too much to say, as shall become apparent in due course, that he thought of nurses, not doctors, as essential. And in this respect, he seems to be characteristically contrarian in his thinking, very unconventional in his thinking. Now, at the time that Gandhi transitioned into adulthood, one name entirely dominated the public perception of nursing, at least in the Anglophone world and the British Empire. And that one name, some of you might have suspected, is Florence Nightingale. Gandhi himself penned a tribute to her in Gujarati in his newspaper, Indian Opinion, which he had established in South Africa. And of course, at this time, he was living in South Africa, several years before her death in August 1910. This piece actually dates to 1905, the tribute that he writes to Florence Nightingale. Though it is a short piece, it is vintage Gandhi and deserving of a much lengthier commentary than I am able to offer at the present moment. Now, some of the language is characteristic of the writing where he speaks of those whom he views as pious and selfless. Quote, there were in those days very few men who considered it an act of mercy and merit to succor the wounded. It was at such a time that this lady, Florence Nightingale, came upon the scene and did good work worthy of an angel descended from heaven, end quote. This is what I mean by that language of, where he is describing someone who's pious and selfless. He describes how through the selfless care of the wounded British soldiers at Scutari, so this is, in the Ottoman Empire, I mean, actually not far from Istanbul or Constantinople, as it used to be called, right? And this is in the context of what is called the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Nightingale and the nurses trained under her immediately brought the mortality rate when she went over with a group of nurses. They brought the mortality rate among the wounded down to 31% from 42% and eventually to 5%. I just want to pause here a second. I want you to think about the staggering mortality rate among the wounded, right? Before she comes there, 42%, right? That was the mortality rate among the wounded. Right? I mean, you think, for example, let's take something like the Vietnam War, which the United States fought over several years and where they lost 57,000 soldiers, but the number of soldiers who were wounded was well over 1.5 million, right? So the mortality rate of the wounded is minuscule in comparison. And one of the reasons why the mortality rate of the wounded has come down is, of course, because of professional nursing and the kinds of regimens of nursing that became introduced. But he loses, in this piece, he loses neither the opportunity to castigate the British government, which he says was as usual, not alive to the situation. That is, that they were dreaming, they were unaware of what was really happening, right? And they really didn't care about their men, right? When war first broke out in Crimea, and he loses neither this opportunity to castigate the British nor to press forward with his own homilies on what might be viewed as the basic principles of nursing. Though the results Nightingale produced were miraculous, he says, they can be easily visualized. If bleeding could be stopped, the wounds bandaged, and the requisite diet given, the lives of many thousands would doubtless be saved. And it's very interesting, actually, the words that he uses, because he says it's a matter of, cleaning the wounds, taking the bandages and putting them on the wounds properly, right? And providing adequate care, diet. And that's really the fundamentals of nursing, right? The only thing necessary, I'm quoting him now, was kindness, which Miss Nightingale provided, end quote. Now, there is nothing on record to suggest that Gandhi had read Nightingale's short manual, Notes on Nursing, published in 1860. And towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to have a very, very short PowerPoint presentation where I'll show you 5 or 6 images and I'll show you the image of this book of this as well. But there can be little doubt that he would have been in agreement with the most fundamental propositions of this book. And I'm quoting Florence Nightingale here now, quote, the very elements of what constitutes good nursing are as little understood for the well as for the sick. The same laws of health or of nursing, for they are in reality the same, obtain among the well as among the sick, end quote. Nevertheless, in the matter of nursing, I want to say to you, as in most other domains of life, Gandhi was essentially self taught. So he knew about Florence Nightingale, but he hadn't read her manual. He hadn't attended a nursing school. He had never probably even really met a nurse, for all I know, right? At this point in time. When he was 16 years old, he nursed his father, who was then suffering from a fistula and was confined to the bed. So, sores basically. And Gandhi talks about this in his own autobiography. I had the duties of a nurse, Gandhi recalled many years later in his autobiography, which mainly consisted in dressing the wound, giving my father his medicine, and compounding drugs whenever they had to be made up at home. Every night, Gandhi massaged his father's legs. I loved to do this service. I do not remember ever having neglected it. But then what? But then came what Gandhi himself called the dreadful night. Overtaken by the carnal urge, Gandhi left his father's bedside to share the bed with his wife Kasturba, to whom he was married when both were 13 years old. He had been with her for all of 5 minutes when a knock came on the door. He opens the door, the servant announces, your father has expired. In the centenary year of Gandhi's birth, in 1969, that is, in an influential book called Gandhi's Truth on the Origins of Militant Nonviolence, Erik Erikson would go on to argue controversially that this incident and Gandhi's guilt over it exercised an incalculable influence on his life. Um, this is not to say that I necessarily agree, but this was an argument made by Erik Erikson. Whatever the merits of Erikson's view, Gandhi's interest in nursing can be traced to this incident. There would be other occasions far too numerous to enumerate where Gandhi would find the opportunity to nurture his instinct for nursing within the ambit of the larger extended family. So, just as Gandhi learned about Satyagraha at home, we should always remember that. Because when we think of Satyagraha, we think of the anti colonial movement. And Gandhi says, I learned about all of these things at home, and I generally learned about them from my mother, right? And it is within the ambit of the family first, the extended family here now, that Gandhi really becomes a nurse first, right? So after his father, now I'm moving to the next set of incidents. Gandhi found himself in Bombay in 1896. Now, at this point in time, he was actually living in South Africa, but he was returning to India every now and then. I can't get into the history of all of those occasions. But in 1896, Bombay was being decimated by bubonic plague. And he chose to spend day and night by the bedside of his brother in law, who had taken seriously ill, and whose own wife, that is Gandhi's sister, was not equal to nursing him. Gandhi could not save his life. However, as he was to write years later in his autobiography, my aptitude for nursing gradually developed into a passion. A passion. So much so that it often led me to neglect my work. And on occasions, I engaged not only my wife, but the whole household in such service. End quote. In 1918, when Gandhi was struck by the so-called, in 1918, when India was struck by the so-called Spanish flu, that is an influenza of 1918-20, which, let me advise all of you, in case you're not aware of it, that according to modern scholarly studies, killed 50 to 100 million people around the globe. And you have to remember that the population of the world at that time was 2 billion, right? And 50 to 100 million is an astronomical number. Remember that the coronavirus now has killed a million, but the population of the world is 8 billion, almost 8 billion today. So so the number of people lost today thus far is a minuscule fraction of the number of people who were killed during the Spanish flu. And of that 50 to 100 million, it is estimated that at least 15 million died in India. At least 15 million, possibly as many as 18 million, especially if you include the so-called native or princely states. All right. So in 1918, when India was struck by the so-called Spanish flu, Gandhi was taken seriously ill. Some have thought that he too had been afflicted with that malignant influenza. Um, and Laura Spinney, in her recent book called Pale Fire, also argues that, but she's entirely incorrect. I can say that with confidence because Gandhi did not have the Spanish flu or the influenza. And there are a number of sources which make that very clear. And in fact, the doctor tells him that you're just suffering from a nervous breakdown due to extreme weakness. These are the words in the autobiography. Though Gandhi remained free of infection, his own nearness to death was brought home to him by the fact that he had lost his grandson, Shantilal, as well as his own daughter in law, Gulab, to the plague. To the extent that scholars have paid any attention whatsoever to Gandhi's lifelong passion for nursing among a wider public, now moving outside the ambit of the home and the family, the narrative generally begins with his initiative in setting up an Indian ambulance corps consisting of 1,100 volunteers during the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. We must recall that Gandhi had made South Africa his home and he spent 20 years there before returning to India for good in January 1915. The South African years are vitally important, more particularly if we consider that Gandhi had acquired experience of nursing under conditions of a pneumonic plague epidemic, which somewhat resonate with the contemporary experience of COVID-19. In 1904, as he details in his book Satyagraha in South Africa, published in 1928, which recounts the struggle waged by Indians in South Africa to oppose racism and gain political recognition, Gandhi was settled in the Johannesburg area at this time, where he had established a law practice. Early that year, he was to write, a virulent plague broke out among the Indians in Johannesburg. I was fully engaged in nursing the patients. He describes his own contribution modestly. However, the autobiography offers a somewhat more detailed account in two short chapters entitled The Black Plague I and The Black Plague II. Gandhi and his friends took possession of a vacant house by breaking in its locks, and shifted 23 Indians suffering from the scourge, nursing them through the night. Let me just explain a little bit of context here so you understand. So in Johannesburg, South Africa, incidentally, at that point in time, I'm using the word a little anachronistically, just a little bit, because the Union of South Africa only came about in 1905. So what you had provinces. So you had, for example, the Cape. You had Natal, which is where actually Indians had first gone as indentured laborers. And of course, not all Indians went as indentured laborers. In South Africa, we can make a distinction between those Indians who went as indentured laborers. They were also known by the derogatory word coolie. And then there were those Indians who paid their own way because they went there as merchants, for example, which is how Gandhi arrived there, not as a merchant, but he was invited by Baba Abdullah, whose family was from Porbandar. And Gandhi was invited to South Africa because Baba Abdullah needed a lawyer to help him with his work, okay, in that part of what then became in 1905 South Africa, the Union of South Africa, right? Right? And in Johannesburg, the Indians were living in a part of town which was known as Coolie Town. Much as in India, let us not forget, when you look at cities like Bombay, right, now Mumbai, but Bombay as it was known for a very long period of time, that there was a dark town. And this is where all the Indians lived. And if you know, lots of Indian cities, particularly in North India, you go to, for example, you go to Delhi, you go to Kanpur, you go to Meerut, cities such as that, they have a cantonment area, right? And that cantonment area was the area which was really for the British. It was for the military, but then you had the civil lines attached to that. And then you had the Indian part of town, which was very often called the Black Town. In South Africa, it was known as the Coolie Town. And it was in that part that this pneumonic plague broke out, right? And this is what Gandhi is really describing, that he is called there, and even though and there are these Indians, and so the first thing that Gandhi does is what? Think of it, right? He takes these Indians, he puts them in a vacant building. He's isolating them. He's isolating them. I mean, if you think about the coronavirus, that's exactly what you do. You quarantine people, you isolate them, right? Right? The following day, the local municipality made available a vacant, if dirty warehouse, which they placed at Gandhi's disposal, leaving the Indians to clean the premises, haul beds into it, and turn it into a temporary hospital. The municipality lent the services of a nurse, whose name Gandhi did not recall years later when he wrote his books, but who has since been identified as Emily Blake, right? And Emily Blake's grandson today has done a lot of research, which I don't cite in this in great detail. I have a much longer piece where I discuss that. Okay, because the grandson of this nurse who dies, he says very clearly that in fact Gandhi saved Johannesburg from the plague with his actions. Right? I mean, he goes so far as to, as I said, really say that. All right. Now, but we have evidence from that period of time, because the following year, the year after the plague, an official account of the plague appeared under the name of the Johannesburg Plague Committee Report. There are only 2 or 3 surviving copies of this work in the world today. And this committee report suggests that neither Miss Blake nor any of the Indians, including Gandhi, that were providing care for the sick, were furnished any protective equipment, right? PPE, as it's called, personal protective equipment, or masks. They had none of that, right? The report tacitly recognizes the part played by Gandhi and another doctor, Dr. Godfrey, who was a physician practicing in Johannesburg, who had come to the aid of the Indians, and recognizes their role in raising the alarm and preventing the plague from taking hold in other parts of the city. Here, and I'm quoting now the report, because it's really quite extraordinary, that you think about the role that it is, that this committee report, an official committee report produced by the British there, is ascribing to Gandhi. The value of, quote, isolating infected persons was immediately appreciated by Dr. Godfrey and Mahatma Gandhi, right? And progress was made before municipal authorities first realized that the epidemic was fully underway. Still another research essay, and that's the one I referred to by the relative of Emily Blake, the nurse who died. She was the only nurse to die there. Still another research essay is more pronounced in underscoring Gandhi's capacious understanding of the circumstances that had no small part in precipitating the plague among Indian indentured laborers, whose health in the best of conditions was feeble, and the role he played in bringing the epidemic under control. Delving into previously unexplored correspondence, Capone notices that since early February 1904, Gandhi had sought to bring to the attention of the chief officer for health for Johannesburg the extremely unsanitary conditions under which the Indians lived and the municipality's gross negligence in safeguarding their health. Writing to him on February 11th, Gandhi described, quote, the shocking state of the Indian location. Rooms appear to be overcrowded beyond description, and the sanitary services had deteriorated. From what I believe, Gandhi notes ominously, quote, I believe the mortality in the location has increased considerably, and it seems to me that if the present state of things continues, an outbreak of some epidemic disease is merely a question of time. Right. All right. End quote. Now, significant as Gandhi's interventions appear to have been to stem the rise of the plague in Johannesburg in 1904, his volunteer work during the Zulu Rebellion is still more remarkable. for what it reveals about the ethics of Gandhi's nursing. It is therefore necessary first to revisit his work on the battlefield in 1899 during the Boer War, to which I have adverted briefly. Um, Though there is an account of this in Gandhi's own writings, the apparent anomaly of him appearing as a nurse in aid of the British is also explored in what is possibly the most exhaustive history of the Boer War by the British historian Thomas Pakenham. And Pakenham here describes Gandhi, at the head of this corps, the 2,000 of these stretcher bearers, including 800 who were from Natal's Indian community, led by a 28-year-old barrister, that is Gandhi. And of course, the reason why Gandhi was willing to do this, because at this point in time, he held to the view that what Indians should aspire for is rights within the empire, within the British Empire. We know that his political views would change considerably many years down the road, right? The work is described, um, that is, in the work that Gandhi himself did in the Boer War, by Gandhi in his own autobiography, but he gives barely 2 lines to it, barely 2 lines. At a critical moment, despite assurances that the ambulance corps would not be required to serve within the firing line, Gandhi and the 1,100 Indians, 800 of whom were still indentured. And I think, one can comment at very great length on that, right? That these Indians are indentured laborers. And I don't have the time right now to describe to you what it meant to be indentured, but indenture, Hugh Tinker, many years ago said, was a different form of slavery, right? Because you're basically living, you're serving under a contract, and the conditions under which you are serving were usually miserable, right? Nonetheless, these people are contributing to the war effort, not on the battlefield physically by using arms, but physically on the battlefield by nursing the wounded, led by Gandhi, right? They accept this risk without hesitation. And Gandhi says during these days, we had to march from 20 to 25 miles a day, bearing the wounded on stretchers. Remarkably, Gandhi rendered his assistance to the British, as I've already suggested, though his own sympathies were with the Boers. As he explained in his autobiography, I felt that if I demanded rights as a British citizen, it was also my duty to participate in the defense of the British Empire. Now, less than 10 years later, Gandhi again found himself raising the Natal Volunteer Ambulance Corps, occasioned by what is known as the Zulu Rebellion. And this is the last set of incidents I'm going to describe before I move on to some concluding thoughts about the pandemic and what Gandhi might have done. All right. The year 1906, this is a very crucial year, okay, is recognized by scholars as a pivotal and doubtless a transformative moment in his life. He took a vow of celibacy and abjured all sexual relations, even with his wife, for the rest of his life. And this on the grounds that he had come to the conviction that procreation, I'm quoting him, that procreation and the consequent care of children were inconsistent with public service, end quote. Now, it is not possible at this juncture to delve into the intricacies of this decision, except to say that, oddly enough, the many scholars who have probed the subject of Gandhi's views on sexuality have not considered the manner in which the vow came to fruition when he was nursing the wounded Zulus. So it was when he was nursing these wounded Zulus, Africans, it is at this time that Gandhi takes the vow of celibacy, right? And so there's a strange connection between nursing and celibacy, and even more strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, it echoes, of course, the views of Florence Nightingale herself, who remained celibate her whole life, remained single her whole life, and I think that she herself was actually very much of the view that if you were celibate, it was a way to render service more productively. The kind of service that she's speaking of, nursing care, rendering service to the public. All right. But I think the matter is more complex. 2 decades ago, in a lengthy paper on the politics of Gandhi's sexuality, I suggested, contrary to the still dominant view that Gandhi's outlook was characterized by an unhealthy and even repulsive form of sexual puritanism, that it is critical to distinguish, I argued, between his repudiation of the sexual act on the one hand, and on the other hand, his love of intimacy and sexuality. Sex and sexuality are not the same. When he took the vow of celibacy, Gandhi did not thereby abjure or give up touch, nor proximity to the bodies of others. Both, I would argue, entirely central to his conception of nursing, right? And I want you to think about touch, because what is it that we cannot do now? During the times of the coronavirus pandemic, we cannot touch others, right? We're asked to keep a distance of, you know, 6 feet, right? And some of the most heartbreaking stories from all over the world is people who have died without their family, their friends being present because they cannot be close by, right? So we have to think about touch. I'm going to get back to it in a moment. But let us hear what Gandhi has to say further. He says, I was delighted on reaching headquarters to hear that our main work was to be the nursing of the wounded Zulus. The medical officer in charge welcomed us. He said white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus, that their wounds were festering, and he was at his wit's end. He hailed our arrival as a godsend for these innocent people. And he equipped us with bandages, disinfectants, etc., and took us to the improvised hotel. The Zulus were delighted to see us, end quote. The festering wounds of which Gandhi speaks were a consequence of the floggings by which the Zulus were browbeaten into submission. These floggings had caused severe sores which had been left unattended. Their protocols of war prevented the British from tending to the wounded Zulus. And as we have seen, Gandhi remarks that white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus. The white people wouldn't touch these Africans. So Gandhi, who had been appointed Sergeant Major of the Corps, commanded a number of men who assisted in tending to the wounded Zulus. Here he resumes his narrative, and I quote, the white soldiers used to peep through the railings that separate us from them and try to dissuade us from attending to the wounds. And as we would not heed them, they became enraged and poured unspeakable abuse on the Zulus, end quote. White people were unwilling to nurse the Zulus, but their voyeurism, but then they're peeping through. So it's their voyeurism as they peep through the railings while the Indians attended to the wounded men is glaring. Sight has been privileged among the senses, at least in the Western tradition, but Gandhi's conduct points to the phenomenological importance of touch in his worldview. And this is where I come back to COVID 19, because one of the greatest calamities of COVID 19 is that, contrary to what we are ordinarily called upon to do when confronted by a grave disaster, it demands of us, COVID demands of us, that we isolate ourselves from others, build fences, and forego the often intimate and unspeakably beautiful pleasures of touch, right? Your grandfather or grandmother is passing, the grandchild wants to touch them. It's that intimacy, that beautiful moment of touch that we are unable to engage in, right? So here we what we have here also is we have a dialectic here where we have to think about the sensorium. We have to think about sight and touch and what is the relationship of the two, right? And why is it that in the Western tradition, I'm suggesting sight is elevated, and in the Indian tradition, actually it was touch. Even though in the Indian tradition, we also have the notion of darshan, right? The gaze, but that's a different realm that we're speaking about here. What is equally inescapable in the magnanimous ethics of hospitality behind the nursing of the Zulus is this. Though Gandhi craved to be accepted as a subject of the British Empire, he plunges headlong into nursing the empire's enemies. So, what might Gandhi then have thought of the present pandemic? The jeopardy in which the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world has been placed, the enormous toll it has taken of human lives, and even considering his own stated passion for nursing, of the advice of scientists and doctors that each one of us should practice social distancing. Right? What would Gandhi have thought of this idea of social distancing? Before turning to this question, it is necessary to reflect on what would be obvious to most people. When Gandhi avers or refers to his passion for nursing or invokes the occasions when he felt called upon to nurse the wounded, he calls to mind a profession that over the course of the 20th century became heavily feminized. Heavily feminized. The feminist critique of nursing as a discourse, practice, and profession has not unreasonably been has torn to shreds the assumption, one that shared one that is shared by Nightingale and Gandhi, that women have a natural aptitude for nursing, or that they are by nature, disposition, and training better suited to the care of the sick than men. Feminists have put into serious question the supposition that women are especially called upon to be self sacrificing. Now, there is a large literature on the subject, but it suffices to introduce briefly only two considerations. First, there is no gainsaying the fact that Nightingale forcefully advocated for women as nurses rather than as doctors. But the feminist critique is perhaps not sufficiently mindful of the fact that even in mid 19th century Britain and Europe, nursing was scarcely a profession for women from respectable homes. We don't realize that. But for Florence Nightingale herself to go into nursing, was in fact in many ways quite revolutionary. Nursing was commonly left to those who came from impoverished families or those women engaged in prostitution. To this extent, Nightingale's endeavor was to make nursing open to respectable or educated women, introduce professional standards, furnish women with secure employment, and liberate women from the tyranny of the home. Secondly, Gandhi's own predilection for nursing can also profitably be viewed within the ambit of his larger design, both of feminizing the public sphere and, in practice, controverting the assigned gender roles that his own writings appear to endorse. The beginning point of a Gandhian view of the pandemic is perhaps to recognize that it would have been one with Nightingale in holding to the view that whatever a patient can do himself, it is better. He was very much his own doctor and a theorist of biopolitics, which placed the responsibility of well being upon each individual and the state. He knew enough about public health and the importance of sanitation. As I think, as I have amply demonstrated by a discussion of his idea about the imminent advance of the plague, the fact that he writes to the municipality, castigates them, right, for not having taken action, and in fact actually accuses them of criminal neglect. This phrase, criminal neglect, is what he uses, which is, of course, exactly the same phrase of indictment I would use for the president of the United States. You know, he's essentially guilty of criminal neglect in the way in which he's handled the coronavirus pandemic. Right? But on the issue of social distancing, Gandhi would likely have displayed some ambivalence. While he would have been critical of the reckless disregard for the lives of others manifested in the behavior of those who are unable to look beyond their own wants, comforts, and drives, it is inconceivable that he would have not found it disconcerting and unacceptable that some are hiding behind the excuse of the pandemic to shun their neighbors, to introduce new hierarchies, and drive a wedge between themselves and others whom they imagine are their social inferiors. Social distancing, we have to be aware, can create its own forms of ghettoization. Gandhi held to the view that there are laws of compensation at work in this universe, however opaque they may be to us. The comparatively clean air in the wake of the shuttering of the world economy, for example, is perhaps a sign to human beings to be mindful of the devastation they have wrought upon planet Earth. But Gandhi was not only one to philosophize. It is impossible to imagine him not present on the scene, tending to the sick and comforting members of their families. Even as his compassion was known to be boundless, nowhere more was this in evidence than in the fearless walk that he undertook through riot torn Noakhali just months before his assassination, comforting the afflicted while accepting the taunts of some as though they were bouquets of flowers. Gandhi was also tough as nails. And I suspect that he would have punished himself to the hilt in working around the clock, organizing relief workers and cajoling people not to rely on government handouts, but to make themselves useful and apply their ingenuity. Gandhi did not require a pandemic to discover, as is true of many of us, if not all of us, that many of those who are among the lowest paid workers are, in fact, the most essential. His relentless critique of industrial modernity has led many people into believing that Gandhi was opposed to science, but this is far from being the case. He was a scientist in his own fashion. In fact, he's writing Hind Swaraj really as a scientific treatise from his standpoint, ceaselessly testing the truth of every proposition. But more critically, he was opposed to scientism, right? Scientism here being the view that whatever problems science has created will also be resolved by science. That's something that Gandhi never accepted. He said you have to step outside that framework, right? While he would have respected scientific advice, I think it can safely be said that Gandhi would have also said that we cannot leave our understanding of the pandemic and its social, political, and philosophical implications to the scientists alone, because the pandemonium engendered by the pandemic is ultimately a reflection of the unrest within each of us and within Homo sapiens as a whole. Magnificent as the nurses have been in tending to the sick and the diseased, we are all called upon to nurse this earth back to health. Something which can only begin with the recognition that as a species we are likely less essential than we have imagined ourselves to be. So thank you. I conclude with that. But before I turn it over to the chair or the moderator, and then for questions, I just want to very briefly share a screen with you, which is to just show you 5 or 6 images. I just want to make sure, are people able to see the screen? Can the screen be seen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So let me just um, show some of the images here. So this, by the way, is the book which will be released next week. My book, The Fury of COVID-19: The Politics, Histories, and Unrequited Love of the Coronavirus. And a very, very small portion of this, literally 7-8 pages, is the presentation I've given today. The lecture I've given today is a much more extensive version of that. This is the book I was referring to by Florence Nightingale, Notes on Nursing, published in 1860. Of course, this is a reprint edition, What It Is and What It Is Not, which became sort of the main manual in a way. As I've already suggested to you, there is no evidence that Gandhi actually knew this work. Also on the subject of Florence Nightingale, who's basically viewed as the founder of the whole profession of nursing. Some of you may be aware that she did extensive work on India, extensive work. She never visited India, but her writings on India have been collected in 2 massive volumes of about 1,000 pages each, because she was primarily responsible for the reforms, sanitation reforms, particularly within the army, which also included such things as regulation of brothels and all of that. But she was fundamentally interested in social reform movements in India, and the question of sanitation, irrigation, nutrition, and all of that. She wrote voluminously on these subjects, All right. And here is, of course, a photograph of Gandhi from his South African years, from the Natal Corps that he raised. And this, where my cursor is, this is Gandhi over here. This is one of the more well-known photographs. This photograph is almost entirely unknown. This is when Gandhi was released. So this is not related to the talk, but it's from the period. This is from Johannesburg. This is when he was released from prison. You see him over here, third from the left over here, outside the prison in Johannesburg. And this is in 1908. And this here, this image over here, is page view in Johannesburg. This is one of the areas where Indians were settled, because the particular coolie lines I was speaking about, where the plague had broken out and where Gandhi nursed the Indians back to health, and possibly, at least according to Capon, saved the city of Johannesburg from the epidemic because he prevented it from spreading. The area where the Indians were staying, Coolie Town, was burnt down by the city, by the municipality, because it was seen as being a place that was unsanitary, and the Indians were shunted around here and there, and eventually they wound up at this place, and they were then thrown out of here. When apartheid became the official policy of South Africa in 1949, and that meant that areas were segregated strictly by race and color. So, uh, you know, this area, the Indians were evacuated from here. And this is the last image here. And with that, I conclude my talk. And this is an image which shows Gandhi tending to, this is the person here. This is, again, a very famous photograph. This is Parchure, and he was a major social worker, but he also suffered from leprosy. And Gandhi tended to his care. This is significant because not only in India, but throughout the world, there was always a dread of the leper, a dread of the leper. If in the West, if you read the Old Testament, if you read Leviticus, the third book of Moses, there's already a discussion there of the kind of panic into which people were thrown by the idea of leprosy, right? And Gandhi, of course, fearless as always, never had any hesitation in tending to the ill, the wounded, or the lepers. And with that, I stop. Thank you very much.